Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a look at the BLON Mini earphones. You may have only just seen my BLON A8 Prometheus review, and that's because I've chosen to record these two videos back to back on the same day and then release them just 2 days apart. I thought they both deserved their own individual reviews, but I wanted to release them at about the same time. So if you're watching this one and you haven't seen the Prometheus video but you'd like to, it is already live, and I'll put a link at the end of this video so you can jump back to the Prometheus video and take a look at that too. But for now, let's talk about the BLON Mini. And I should say, a huge thanks goes out to Melbourne HiFi Audio for making this review possible. They sent me both the Mini and the Prometheus for these reviews. And so as always, to say thank you to them, I'll put a link down below. If you like what you hear about these and you want to buy a pair, do think about clicking through that link, buying from Melbourne HiFi Audio and saying thank you to them for making the review possible. There's no affiliates or kickbacks, it's just a thank you. And so now, let's talk about the BLON Mini. This is the $30 IEM, or about 47 Australian dollars, and it makes it a potential consideration for the budget IEM lovers out there. In doing my reading and research for this review, it does seem like BLON have tried to take another step forwards from IEMs like the BL03 and the BL01, but on this occasion they've taken the same driver principles and applied them in a different style of housing. Their approach now is this really interesting, I'm going to take the cable off, kind of earworm style thing. I'm going to hold that forward. I don't normally do this, but so they've got this really interesting kind of wormy style design that I find quite unique, and surprisingly it's more comfortable than it might look. What they've decided to do here is make the body out of a zinc alloy and turn it into a very ergonomic shape that kind of just burrows its way, and I mean that in a good way, not a bad way, but burrows its way into your ear canal when you insert it. And that brings me to another fascinating point. I've traditionally hated the BLON ear tips, and I'm excited to say that for the first time ever, the BLON ear tips finally work really well. And that's because they have more of a conical profile to their ear tips rather than the spherical profile of most ear tips on the market. And that means that with this particular IEM, because it's designed to kind of go deeper into the ear canal, that ear tip works just fine. So this is the first time I'm reviewing a BLON earphone with the BLON ear tips attached. It's a minor thing, but I thought it was worth mentioning. The other things worth discussing is that this is using a 16 ohm, 115 decibel sensitivity driver. So again, like all the IEMs from BLON, they're very easy to drive on any device you like. In addition to that, I've covered off the tips, I've covered off the general design. There's also the cable, which thankfully, much like the Prometheus, although not exactly the same as the Prometheus, is a much better cable than what we're used to seeing from BLON. This time around, it's once again silver-plated copper. It's not quite as heavy and luxurious as the cable on the Prometheus, but it's very, very nice and still a good upgrade over the twisted black cables that came with the BL03, the BL01, etc. So all in all, we're on a good path. For $30, you're getting tips that are actually functional now, you're getting a nice cable, you're getting a really good design of earphone, and then the question comes down to how does it all sound, of course. And the answer is that for $30, it sounds great, but it is a departure from what you might be used to from the BL01 or the BL03. And I'm putting a lot of that down to the deeper insertion. So as the earphone inserts deeper into the ear, there's less chance for the various frequencies coming out of the tip of the earphone to resonate or reflect inside the ear canal itself. And I think that's playing a part in the characteristics of the BLON Mini. Not that they're bad, they're just a bit different to what you'll hear from something like the BL01, which I will talk about soon. Overall, as BLON are generally very good at doing, the tonality from the Mini is generally pretty good. It's well balanced overall, it's quite natural overall, it's a good IEM to listen to. They have continued to apply a little bit of extra emphasis to the upper end of the register, and it can make things a little bit unnatural with things like female vocals, percussion, areas like that it just brings a little bit too much air and too much texture sometimes, and that can skew tonality a little bit, but it's pretty minor and not something that would put me off listening to the minis. That treble though can get a little bit too much in hot recordings, and by that I mean recordings that have got sharp or bright treble to begin with. But on normal recordings where there's not an overemphasized treble, they do toe the line nicely and are completely fine. Bass extension and weight is very good, particularly for a very small driver like this, and they overall deliver a tight, punchy and full sense of sound. Where things get quite different though, because what you've heard me say so far might sound like I'm describing the Prometheus, the O1, the O3, but where things get different is in sound staging. And this is the part that I'm putting down to, and I'm not sure on this, but I'm putting it down to the deeper insertion. The soundstage from the minis is very tight. It's a small soundstage, it's very much inside the head. It's not bad, but it's not a good sense of space like you get from the other BLON earphones. Individual separation of sounds is quite good, but there's not a lot of space for that separation to occur in, and that does limit the sense of expansiveness in the overall sound. It also means that you're not getting a lot of depth perception from the minis. They do produce a little bit of height perception, so for instance, a singer, the vocalist, will sound a little bit higher than a snare drum, but you won't necessarily hear that the snare drum is behind the singer as they would be in a normal situation. So the soundstage presentation isn't amazing, but it is interesting, and there's enough space between sounds that I never felt like it was congested. It was just different to what I'm used to, and maybe not entirely natural, but not unenjoyable. But let me put all of this in perspective with a couple of quick comparisons, starting off with an obvious one in the BLON BLO1. The BLO1 is an older model now compared to the Mini, and its $27 price tag means it's just a tiny bit cheaper. I've already covered off the fact that I don't think it's got as good accessories, given that the cable's not so good. The tips are also generally unusable with the BLO1 because it's got pretty funky ergonomics. So in that regard, the Mini is an instant upgrade because you can use the tips, it's got a better cable, and the ergonomics are much better so long as you're comfortable with a fairly deep insertion. I have weird ear canals and I don't always enjoy deep insertion earphones, but these work really well for me. They're not like endomotics where they're going to be tickling your eardrums, but they do go deeper than your average kind of outer ear sitting earphone. One thing that I should flag when comparing the BLO1 pretty much with anything is that fit is an issue with those sometimes, particularly for me. And so there may be variations between what one person hears with a BLO1 and what another person hears. So do take that into account, but I tried to make sure I got a really good seal and a very consistent sound to what I expect from the BLO1s before I did any of my comparisons with the Mini. For this test, I was listening to Better Than I Am by Buckshot LaFonk. And on that particular track, the Mini did a really nice job at producing a sense of a black background and a good sense of separation between all the sounds, whereas the BLO3 kind of spread everything out more, and there was a sense that there was kind of some noise in the background. There wasn't actually noise, but the point I'm making here is that I think because of some of the upper mid and maybe treble emphasis coming from the BLO1, it didn't allow a sense of blackness behind the notes, and therefore everything kind of bled together a bit from a spatial point of view. I couldn't pick out the individual sounds as well as I could in the Mini, even though the space from the BLO1 was clearly larger than the fairly confined Mini soundstage. The Mini also produces a slightly richer, fuller sound. It's not vastly different, and again, this is one thing that might be quite variable depending on seal and individual sort of ear anatomy, if you like. But I felt like the Mini provided just a slightly warmer, richer tonality that overall I definitely preferred. They're not vastly different. We're talking, a decibel here or there difference, but I did feel like it gave a better overall tonality to the Mini that I did prefer to the O1. And I quite like the O1. Once I got the tips and the fit right on the O1, it's an IEM that I've really enjoyed and often recommended. But I do feel like the Mini maybe just pips it a little bit. Ultimately though, these are very similar IEMs. So if I had to describe the two, what I'd say is I feel like the Mini is the smoother, more refined version of the BLO1 that's got a more compressed soundstage but a better sense of individual separation of notes within that smaller soundstage. And so I thought it was worth maybe looking up a level to a slightly more expensive earphone, and I happen to have the Tin HiFi T2 Plus. Those are a really solid earphone at the $60 price range, and so I was curious to see how the Mini at half the price could compare to the T2 Plus. The T2 Plus is a more traditional fit, it's generally pretty easy to get a good seal with it, but other than that, both are pretty comparable. They've got decent comfort and fit, they've got metal body designs, overall they're pretty comparable in terms of the quality of the devices, and therefore it is going to come down a lot to the sound in which you prefer. For this test, I fired up Don't Start Lying to Me Now by Joss Stone. And on this track, the T2 Plus got a little bit too dry at the upper end of things, particularly probably because of a female vocal being involved. It just overdid the emphasis in those upper mids, lower treble areas, and it did make things a bit less enjoyable as a result. Having said that, the Mini also had a little bit of upper end dryness, not quite as much as the T2 Plus, but it did have a bit there. And that makes me wonder if maybe the track is mixed a little bit skewed in that direction, and so both of them are then overemphasizing what's already there in the track. Moving on though, the bass in the Mini is clearly punchier and has a bit more weight and presence to it from the Mini. And on a track like this, that's really valuable. The other thing that it does is it means that the mids have a bit more weight, and what it also does is bring the mids forward and into focus for the listener. The T2 Plus, a bit like the BLO1, has a more open sound overall, and probably a little bit more resolution and detail retrieval, but it does so at the expense of sort of flattening things out a bit. One of the things I found myself really enjoying about the Mini was the way it kind of, whilst it was in a smaller soundstage space, produced a beautiful sense of separation between the sounds and allowed me to focus on, in most cases, whatever was happening in the mid-range, which generally is where the majority of the information we're wanting to focus on is actually sitting. Whether it's instruments, vocalists, a combination of all. The T2 Plus, on the other hand, spreads everything out, much like the BLO1, into a bit of a wall of sound. It does it better than the BLO1, it is a more resolving and cleaner sounding earphone, but it's not necessarily as engaging and enjoyable as the Mini could be. There's a piano solo in this track at around about the 2-minute 40 mark, and it was a really nice differentiator of these two. The T2 Plus came across more articulate and cleaner in the sound, there's a bit more textural nuance, but the Mini had a more full, rich and resonant sound. And it's an interesting situation because in an ideal world, you want both of those married together. You want that richness of the harmonic resonance of the piano, but you still want it to sound articulate, you want to hear the hammer strikes on the strings, all of that should be married together. So it's not like either earphone here is better. What they're both doing is good, but it's only a part of the ideal representation of a piano. And so these are earphones that I would have a hard time separating. I actually think they're more comparable than their price might suggest. The T2 Plus is the more neutral sounding earphone, but it does have a bit of a treble tilt. And then I'd say the Mini is the warmer sounding earphone with more of a mid-range tilt. So each of them has its own benefits, its own pros and cons. Neither is good or bad specifically, or I probably should say neither is better or worse. It's going to come down to your personal preferences. Ultimately for me, you could choose any of the 3 earphones I've covered in this review and be very, very happy. It's going to depend on your preferences as to which one's the right choice for you. The BLON Mini though represents a really interesting presentation that I haven't heard a lot of in the current IEM market. It's got this nice kind of mid-focus with a nice sense of separation in a contained sort of within the head stage type sound. And that to me is really enjoyable. I like the Mini because it's different. I'm not going to sit here and say it's better than anything else I've talked about here, but it's definitely an IEM that if you want a different flavour, you want to try something a bit unique, but not straying into anything that's massively coloured, then I do think the Mini is a really cool choice to try out, particularly at the price. For $30 US, it's very hard to go wrong. So if that sounds like an IEM that's of interest to you, do check out the links through to Melbourne HiFi Audio down below to say thank you to them. And if you found this review useful and helpful, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and like. It really helps the channel out. For now though, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.